Welcome to the Luminary Room, where hidden systems meet open minds. I'm Nico, also known online as 369 Lumineer, and this is episode 1 titled How Elite Money Recast Western Education. So let's dive into something that's been shaping our world for well over a century. It's something you probably walk past every day without thinking twice. The way we educate our children. The classrooms, the textbooks, the exams, even the way schools are built. It's all part of a system that was quietly engineered a long time ago. And honestly, it's wild when you start tracing who was behind it all. So today I want to talk about 3 men in particular. George Peabody, John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. You've heard the names probably, mostly in the context of money, industry and, yes, monopolies. But what you might not realise is how their wealth and influence didn't just shape banks or railroads at the time. They shaped the very education system that millions of children in Western countries around the world still use today. And not necessarily in ways that encouraged curiosity or independent thinking. So, okay, it all began quietly, not with marches, not with laws, not even with speeches. It started with donations. That word, you've all heard, philanthropy. Sounds nice, right? Very benevolent. It conjures images of being generous and giving. Well, in the late 19th century, in around the mid to late 1800s, a new form of philanthropy was emerging, one that looked charitable on paper, but was strategic in practice. Back then, money was power, but it was subtle power. You didn't have to run for office or win elections or push legislation through Congress. You just funded the right schools, sat on the right boards, and suddenly you were shaping how children thought before they even realised it. So let's start with George Peabody. This guy was a banker, an international financier, and in 1867, he launched the Peabody Education Fund. On the surface of it all, the goal was pretty simple: rebuild schools in the post-Civil War South and improve education. Millions of dollars went to schools, teacher training, and standardised curricula. It sounds pretty noble, right? But the model was revolutionary in a different way. Peabody set up a small board of trustees to decide which schools got money and what counted as proper education. Decisions weren't democratic, they were managerial. So in other words, the power didn't reside in communities or local educators. It resided in the hands of a few people with a very clear idea of what education should be. Peabody's approach became the blueprint for what we now refer to as educational philanthropy. Money wasn't just a gift, it was a lever. And this idea that you could steer a society through funding without ever touching legislation would be magnified in the decades to come. Then came John D. Rockefeller, and I'm sure most people have heard of him in what the mainstream refers to as conspiracy circles. By 1902, he had created the General Education Board in the US, or the GEB. And here's the kicker. He did on a national scale what Peabody had done regionally. Rockefeller's first gift to the GEB was about $1 million. That equates to roughly 400 million in today's currency. But it didn't stop there. The funds flowed, tens of millions more, touching almost every state in America. But again, this wasn't just charity. Schools that accepted GEB money didn't just take the cash. They accepted oversight. In fact, field agents from the board would visit, curriculum consultants would weigh in, and teacher training programs were aligned with GEB goals. Vocational and agricultural education, especially in the South, got priority. It was education, yes, but with a strong industrial logic baked in. Efficiency, productivity and compliance over critical thought. A guy by the name of Raymond Fosdick, who worked with Rockefeller at the time, actually wrote that the GEB wanted to make education, and this is a quote, scientific and efficient. Think about that. Efficiency is an industrial term. It's factory language. It's not about nurturing creativity. It's about output. Students were being prepared to fill predetermined roles in the workforce, not to challenge the status quo or to innovate. Which is where you've probably heard the quote, usually attributed to Rockefeller, "I don't want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers." But more of that in a moment. Meanwhile, JP Morgan, another titan of finance, and another one of those guys who has been touted in plenty of conspiracy circles, think Titanic, think Nikola Tesla, took a different approach but ended up with a similar effect. He didn't fund rural schools or teacher training. Instead, he focused on what you might call the cultural scaffolding of society. And that's museums, libraries, universities, and elite institutions. The knowledge that mattered and was considered respectable was carefully curated. Certain ideas were canonised and others were quietly pushed aside. So together you have Rockefeller shaping mass education and Morgan shaping elite culture. Two sides of the same coin. One moulds the majority into efficient workers, the other decides what counts as elite knowledge. Peabody, Rockefeller and Morgan didn't need to hold secret meetings or whisper about plans in any smoke-filled rooms. Although for all we know, Rockefeller and Morgan may have done so. The alignment happened through money, trusteeship and a shared world view. Order and efficiency matter more than imagination or independent thinking. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, there was a quote that gets thrown around a lot. "I don't want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers." Well, most people attribute this to Rockefeller. And here's the thing, he almost certainly didn't say it. The earliest traceable version I could find comes from a source decades before his birth. But the sentiment, well, it fits like a glove. The actions of the GEB, the prioritisation of vocational education over liberal education for most children, the focus on measurable outcomes over curiosity. It all reflects that industrial logic. Whether he said it or not, the ethos was built into that system. And here's another piece of the puzzle. Textbooks. Have you ever thought of that? Between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, educational materials underwent extensive rewriting. This period is now referred to as educational revisionism. Historical narratives were reframed to emphasise industrial progress, national unity, obedience to authority. Complex issues like labour movements, Indigenous resistance and class conflict were muted or omitted entirely. And so students weren't being brainwashed with overt lies. They were just being guided in what was considered thinkable. It's subtle, but it's powerful. If you control the curriculum, you don't need to tell students what to think. You just limit what they can think about. And yes, that's still happening in different forms today. And we shouldn't also forget the architecture of schools. The long corridors, the rows of desks being dictated by an authoritarian figure, bells at every moment, locked doors, cafeterias run like canteens. And when you add in the strict rules, surveillance and even security officers, it starts to look a lot like a prison. Well, scholars have been pointing this out for over a century now. A French historian and philosopher, Michel Foucault, who was also an author, a literary critic, a political activist and teacher, even drew parallels between school layouts and carceral institutions in his work titled Discipline and Punish. Education was designed to manage populations, not to liberate them. It's what scholars now call the school-to-prison pipeline. So when you combine all of this, the funding, the oversight, the curricular control, the architecture, you start to see a pattern. This is the nation of workers' ethos, not because anyone conspired in secret, but because the structure itself produces compliance and productivity. Schools became machines, quietly steering children to fill predetermined social and economic roles. And here's the kicker. None of this is conspiracy theory. The documents exist. The funds existed and still do. The reports exist. You can go into the archives of the GEB, the Peabody Fund, or the Morgan Library and see it all for yourself. What's rarely discussed is the worldview that guided it: efficiency, hierarchy, and a belief that social order was more valuable than imagination. So when we talk about creativity, critical thinking, and innovation, it's worth pausing. We're still running on an educational operating system designed over 100 years ago by industrialists. It's that simple. And we wonder why schools often feel rigid, why tests dominate, why curiosity sometimes gets sidelined, why naturally creative and innovative types never excel at school. It's not accidental, it's legacy. Which therefore begs the question, who should design the next system? Who decides what children learn and how? How do we reclaim education so it cultivates thinking citizens and not obedient workers? Because make no mistake, these are questions that demand answers, not platitudes. So if you start looking at philanthropy, for example, you'll see this pattern repeat across sectors in public health, science, arts, and the media. Wherever elite money flows, it comes with guidance, oversight, and an implicit agenda. And it works quietly, under the radar, by design, not through laws or coercion, but through influence. It's kind of unsettling, isn't it? To realise that so many of the structures we take for granted today were designed with efficiency, control, and order as their priority. It challenges the comforting narrative that education is neutral, that schools are purely civic spaces. Well, think again. But here's one thing. Recognising it is the first step, which is why I decided to launch this podcast series. Once you see the architecture of control, the limitations baked into curricula, the influence of private foundations on public life, you can start to ask, how could it be different? How should it be different? What would a system look like that actually cultivates thinking citizens? And if we don't ask, nobody will. The structures won't change themselves. They were designed to persist, and they do. But history is immutable. People change it, communities change it. Teachers, parents and students can change it, but only if they see the full picture. So as you walk past your local school tomorrow or sit in a classroom or even read a textbook, I want you to think about this. Every choice in that system, every curriculum decision, every standardised test, every architectural feature, it has a history. And that history has its authors. Some of them are long gone, like Peabody, Rockefeller and Morgan, but their influence is still here. The question we all face today is sharp and unavoidable. Do we let it continue unchallenged, or do we start imagining something radically different? Because if schools were designed to produce workers, maybe it's time to design ones that produce thinkers. And that's what the Luminary Room is all about. Not speculation, not hype, not conspiracy. Just peeling back the layers, looking at the forces that shaped our world, and asking how they might be reshaped. If you want to read more, the full article is on Medium and the link is in the description. In the next episode, we'll turn our attention to a different kind of influence, how royal taste and elite endorsement helped normalise modern drugs in Victorian Britain, shaping markets, medicine, international cartels and culture in ways that still ripple through our lives today. So until then, think critically, question deeply, and don't accept any story at face value. I'm Nico, and this was episode 1 of the Luminary Room, where hidden systems meet open minds.